Welcome back to the show. Joining us now is writer and broadcaster Esther Krakue. Esther, Harry's libel matter was back in the courts this week. It's been reported he's had a bit of a setback. What's happened?
So Harry has effectively lost the right to have the ANL, so the Associated Newspapers, defence of an honest opinion thrown out. So Harry is basically suing the ANL for an article that was published in the Mail on Sunday in February 2022, and he's calling that article libelous, and it's to do with his ongoing lawsuit with the Home Office over his armed security. Now he's arguing that the article effectively defamed him and had a very negative impact on his integrity and his honesty, and it has a negative impact on his charity work and his fight against misinformation online. Now, what I have noticed is there's a bit of a disconnect between Harry's perception of his reputation and his actual reputation, but we'll get into that later on. Anyway, he was petitioning the court to basically throw out the ANL's defense that it was an honest opinion, and what they're citing is basically when Harry's lawsuits with the Home Office and REVEC specifically, which is the committee in charge of sort of royal security and security for high-ranking or famous people, basically people that are considered high risk in public. He said that it was basically the Home Office refusal to allow him to pay for this armed heightened protection, when actually he only offered to pay according to documents after this matter went to court. So really his actual lawsuit was based on the fact that he disagreed with RAVEC's assessment that he was going to not have 24/7, armed security like working members of the royal family have, but he would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And the argument, in the case in general, is whether basically he should be able to set a precedent for actually having an individual, private citizen like himself, be able to pay for armed police protection, which is, unheard of, and that's why the court has been reluctant to do so, and he's now appealing the court's original refusal to allow him to do that. But he's basically arguing in this particular case that the ANL's honest opinion defense is libelous, and it goes against his character, it defames him, it apparently has a negative impact on his reputation, on his charity work, on his work against misinformation. I would just like to point out that his charity work, particularly with Archewell, according to reports, tallies up to about 50 odd hours a year. So about 1 hour a week. Now, I know he has kids, but most people happen to work 8 to 9 hours a day. So I don't think this is the kind of extensive charity work that anyone had in mind. But anyway, the basic premise here is that the court is upholding the ANL's defense of an honest opinion, which newspapers and, in fact, anyone is allowed to have in the UK. We still do have some semblance of freedom of speech, believe it or not.
Now, one topic which keeps coming up over and over again is Harry's security and the circumstances in which that security is no longer provided to him. But a letter from the Queen has surfaced this week. It's shed a little bit more light on all of this, hasn't it?
Yes, so Edward Young, which you may remember is not a very favoured person, according to Harry's book Spare. He described the late Queen's former private secretary as a fuzzy, middle-aged white man who apparently has an oval, egg-shaped face, which is an interesting assessment because you could level those same descriptions at Prince Harry himself. But he has come out and said that the Queen took Meghan and Harry's personal security very seriously, and she also cited, obviously the heightened risk that came with Princess Diana, and she said that she did support, obviously, the Sussexes having round-the-clock security while their status within the royal family was being assessed. Now, obviously, this decision is not in the hands of the royal family. It's in the hands of REVEC, the Home Office committee responsible for the royal family's security. And so, you would get a different impression if you basically went according to what Prince Harry attested, particularly in his book Spare, saying that, in his book, Prince William looked at him like he wanted to kill him and that he was basically arguing with his family over his right to paid protection, when actually the decision wasn't for members of the royal family, it was for a separate committee. So, the Queen did obviously take the security of Meghan and Harry very seriously, and that's been reflected by the reports of her private secretary. but Prince Harry is not accepting that assessment. I would also like to point out that a lot of the public are a bit confused or not necessarily warming up to Prince Harry's insistence on public security. This is someone who lives in the US. America is a country, as we all know, that you have the right to bear arms. You can be shot walking into Walmart. As we've seen in the University of Nevada this weekend, you can be shot because a disgruntled professor didn't have a job offer from a particular university. He feels comfortable in the US because he has access to armed security. But in the UK, he doesn't have that kind of access because firearms are regulated differently and firearm officers are a completely different section of public life. Now, the misconception here is that if he's in the UK, he will receive no security and that he will not be protected. That is actually not the case. So most celebrities like, the Beckhams and anyone who's wealthy enough to afford private security have a private security detail that is often assisted by the police as and when threats become, relevant or they become exposed. So in the case of Holly Willoughby, for instance, it was actually the conjunction between her private security and the police that, revealed a plot by someone who's basically trying to stalk and harm her. And now obviously that case is ongoing. But to paint this picture that he wouldn't receive any security is not the case. It was going to be on as and when needed basis. So he wouldn't get the 24/7 security that working members of the royal family get. He would get security basically as and when he needed it. And it's also important to point out that Prince Andrew doesn't receive that kind of security, as he was stripped of his royal titles due to his proximity with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. He was also stripped of the privilege of that kind of security as well. So he only gets it, again, if he's engaged in royal duties or at a royal engagement, but he does have to pay for his own security. So I just wanted to clear that up because there is this idea that if he's in the UK, he will not be safe or he will not be afforded any security. That's not true. As a UK citizen, he does have protection from the government. That is his legal right. It just depends on the extent of it. And since he's not an active working member of the royal family, that has been altered.
And Esther, look, there hasn't been a formal response from the royal family in the aftermath of the release of Endgame. But look, we understand from, palace sources that the king won't be emotionally blackmailed by Prince Harry. Is that the position?
That's definitely the position. I mean, I don't know if you remember, a few weeks ago for the King's birthday, they allegedly received a call from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and their children, wishing him happy birthday. He did hint that him and Meghan would accept an invitation to Sandringham for Christmas this year, although it has not been clear that even an offer of an invitation has been made. So those are interesting reports there. But we know that when the King decided to terminate the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's ability to live at Frogmore Cottage earlier this year in the summer, he apparently called his father and said, "Don't you want to see his grandchildren? Don't you want to see your grandchildren?" And many people took that as a form of emotional blackmail. We know that the royal family have been quite mute on this issue with Omid Scobie's book and the revelation that the royal racists are apparently King Charles and Princess Catherine, which which most of the public don't seem to pay much mind to. But at the end of the day, the reality is Prince Harry has effectively eroded any sort of possibility of any meaningful relationship with his family. And I think that's a reality that's really starting to sink in. I really don't understand on what planet he thinks his behavior over the last few years would be conducive to any sort of relationship with his family. Most people saying that, if they had a family member that behaved in the way that Meghan and Harry have, there's no relationship there to be salvaged. And I really think he's deluded himself into believing that he can have it all.
And Esther, another topic which keeps rearing its head is obviously the circumstances around which Harry and Meghan left the royal family. Apparently this week there's been another explanation.
Yeah, so apparently, as part of the ongoing case in court over Prince Harry's security, he gave a very heartfelt testimony via his solicitor saying that the UK was his home and that him and Meghan didn't want to step down from royal duties, but they felt they were forced out. They didn't have any choice. He's basically making the case that the reason why he believes his family should have, protection, 24/7 protection by armed officers here in the UK is because it is part of him and his children's heritage and that he never really wanted to leave. Now, again, many people are not really warming to this idea, because at one, we know that the Queen offered them a 1-year transition period and a chance to rethink what they really wanted to do in the royal family. So, you know, it's very clear that from the Queen's side and from many of the senior royal members of the royal family, they didn't really want this to be hasty or acrimonious in the way that it ended up being. And secondly, you know, the prince was presented with various options. One of the options was to keep calm and carry on in their royal duties, and they chose not to do that. The option that they favoured was to have kind of a half-in, half-out approach. Now, obviously, the Queen, understanding the pressures of royal life, particularly on a couple with young children, that's why she offered them this sort of 1-year cooling-off period. But they didn't take that opportunity. They decided to leave the UK, and you know, they were tailed by Netflix cameras. I mean, we all remember that image from their docuseries about this is the freedom flight of them leaving the UK. So from most people's perspective, it looked like they were pretty happy to actually leave. I think they only really got the hump when they realized that they weren't going to get paid protection or the kind of conditions that they expected to when they actually left. At the end of the day, you know, Prince Harry has really let himself down in the way that he's conducted himself. Many people were saying he's going to regret his actions. And I think, you know, he actually is. To try and manipulate the courts to say that actually he didn't feel like he had a choice and that he was forced out. I don't really know what he thinks that kind of defense is going to do. That has nothing to do with his paid security. At the end of the day, that's kind of, you know, tugging at the heartstrings, which is... for anyone familiar with the law, doesn't necessarily go down very well. But again, it's the question of, can these people actually take responsibility for their actions? No one forced them to do the Netflix documentary. No one forced them to do the Oprah interview. No one forced them to write spare and the kind of disparaging things he said about members of his own family. They did that of their own volition, and they've made a lot of money from it. So it's very strange for him to think that he actually has any sort of place in public life, or that he didn't make the decisions that he made and that he was somehow given no choice but to leave the royal family, according to him.
Now, we know that King Charles attended at COP28. He gave a speech, which is a little bit controversial in itself, depending who you speak to. But there was also a controversy around a tie that he wore at the conference. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the king wore a tie with the Greek flag on it, basically, and many people are alluding to that this was in tacit support of the Greek Prime Minister, which, if you remember, a few weeks ago, Rishi Sunak cancelled a meeting with him because there were disagreements over what he wanted to discuss. Apparently, he was going to use his platform with Rishi Sunak to discuss the return of the Elgin marbles. Now, I have to be transparent and say that I have no dog in this fight with regards to the Elgin marbles. I'm not Greek. I do think there is a strong case to returning the marbles, but again, I don't. It's not something that keeps me up, or most of the members of the British public, up at night. Most people don't even know what they are. But there's been kind of this ongoing PR dispute, particularly with the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, and Rishi Sunak, over whether these marbles should be returned, whether it was right for Rishi Sunak to cancel the meeting over that. I happen to think that he was actually right, because even if you do want to discuss the Elgin marbles, it's not at a meeting where it has been designated to discuss other more pressing issues like immigration in Europe and the economy and all of that. Now, I don't actually think this move by King Charles to wear a tie with the Greek flag on it was in tacit kind of agreement with the Prime Minister of Greece, even though I suspect he probably leans more towards returning the Elgin marbles. We have to remember that King Charles's father, Prince Philip, was actually Greek. He was a Greek prince. So it's not surprising that he will have some affinity with his heritage in that way. I think actually King Charles is more clever than people give him credit for, and I don't think he will make those kinds of sort of PR blunders lightly. And so I do think that there is an element of bad faith. You know, I'm not necessarily fond of King Charles still going to COP28 and still trying to get involved in an increasingly political debate with regards to action to tackle climate change and all of that. But I do think in this particular instance, it was just happened to be something to celebrate his own heritage.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, we touched on the Duke of Westminster's upcoming wedding and the fact that the Sussexes were excluded from attending. But a revelation this week that the Sussexes weren't necessarily excluded, rather they chose not to attend.
Yeah, so apparently, according to sources close to the Sussexes, and it's interesting that Sussexes are learning how to use sources close to them. That was one of Prince Harry's gripes in his book about, the palace briefing, close sources, but now they seem to be using it themselves, so they're understanding how to spin the PR game themselves. Anyway, apparently, according to sources close to the Sussexes, Harry called Hugh Grosvenor himself and apologized for having to excuse himself from the wedding, which would take place in June of next year. He said that he didn't want an awkward family meeting, and that the presence of him and his wife Meghan would actually take away the spotlight from his son's godfather's wedding and special day. And we obviously know that he would likely run into Kate and William, and that would be awkward considering all the flattering things he said about them both in his book Spare, amongst other things. So that's apparently what we're hearing. We're hearing that Harry excused himself from this wedding, which I suspect was probably a good idea, actually, because it would have drawn the attention away from them. But I think it's part of the bigger picture of, the actual increasing isolation of the Sussexes. They've effectively exiled themselves, whether they like to admit it or not. And I think that reality is really hitting hard.